Hello, friends and Equilter fans and Paula Nadelstern fans. We are so excited to have Paula Nadelstern visiting with us today. And Paula is an old friend, but actually I've known her longer than she knew me. We're going to talk about that. And we're actually going to do more than one segment here. We're going to start out by talking to Paula about her textile art, her textile designing, and her long-term working relationship with Benartex, and maybe we'll talk about some of the museums that she's been in. But first of all, I just want to welcome you, Paula. I'm here in Boulder, Colorado at Equilter.com, and you're there in New York. And
I'm on the 9th floor of my 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, looking out on Van Cortlandt Park, and it's wonderful to talk to you. Today's our
great
spring.
And, the magic of Zoom, that's one of the great things post-pandemic is we figured out that we can talk to each other even if we're not together physically. So I'm sending you sending you a big hug, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me. We, as you mentioned, we have known each other for quite a lot of years, a long time.
Yes. Well, I just want to introduce Paula by telling a quick little story myself, and that is when I left the textile and fashion industry in New York and moved to Colorado, and I was looking for something new, and I discovered quilting, and then I discovered quilt guilds. The very first time I went to hear a lecture was with the State Quilt Guild, the CQC, and the speaker was Paula, and it was so exciting. Yeah, because I had just moved from New York and she was talking about making quilts on her kitchen table in New York. And so I immediately bonded with you, even though I was sitting in the back of the big audience. And that was the beginning of my relationship with Paula. But Paula is, of course, an icon and just a genius and a huge talent and a huge inspiration.
Trying not to respond, but you're embarrassing me. But
yes.
Thanks.
And
so
she's
much.
also very humble. She really is. But I have to say that about you because it's true. But, would you just start off by any of those topics that I just mentioned? Is there something that comes to mind that you might want to share a story with us?
Well, when you speak like that, I mean, my brain is like a pinball machine. It's just going, oh, talk about that. And that's exactly how I use fabric and design fabric and design myself. I have to have all my fabric out at the same time when I'm designing so that I can sort of, oh, maybe I'll use that, or this looks good with this. I'm not, I know that my quilts make it look like I'm a very organized, maybe even obsessive person, and yet I'm not. I'm exactly the opposite of that. I just, as the years went by, I got myself tighter and tighter in order to create what I wanted, but I'm not really that person. So what were all the topics you mentioned? I'm working now on the 46th quilt in my kaleidoscopic series. And when I made the very first one, I didn't know I was going to be working in a series. And that goes back, early mid 90s, probably like 1986 was really my first kaleidoscope quilt. And because I don't have an art background, I didn't know what a gift it was that I was giving myself, the time to work in a series. And so that, and at the same time that I've been working in these series, I've also had the honor of being introduced to Benartex and to Mr. B when he, I've been working with Benartex over 25 years. And I don't come from the same background as you. I don't come from that academic education in either textiles, fabric. I've taught myself everything really. And I'm not, and when I say teach, I mean, I grew up, I've mentioned this, you heard me talk about this at the International Quilt Museum. I grew up with a mom who everything was just sort of good enough. And I kind of have that good enough attitude. Like I don't go into a subject that deeply. I'm just learning enough to get to the next stage. But working in a series is really the gift of, revisiting an idea I had many years ago, coming either in terms of fabric or even in terms of the quilts themselves. And so, ask me a question about working with Benartex or anything.
Yeah. Well, I'll just throw in something because I knew Mr. B too. In fact, I had dinner with him at the last quilt market that he attended, and that was really quite an honor, very special. And maybe just talk about Mr. B for a minute. I mean, he was a very special person, and you and I both really appreciated his appreciation, right? I mean, he was so passionate.
I was working with a different company and walked a designer who was visiting from New York, from Texas, who wanted to talk to him. And I said, I'll sit out in the lobby, but I can't go inside the building. You know, I can't go with you because I'm working for another company, which was a real disaster experience working with another company. It was just horrible. And I was just thinking, why am I doing this? I was doing it. My daughter was just around the age of going into college, and I was hoping for another, you know, stream of money, you know, but I really, and then he just kept insisting, no, come on in. And he wanted me to see this line. What do you think of this? And what do you think of that? And then he called me up again and a couple of times, and he needed an idea for like having a someplace to have a warehouse. And did I know anyone? And I was able to hook him up with some people in Pennsylvania. And it was just always that, but it's no, until that other company and I sort of dissolved completely. And then I was able to go and work with Benertex. And he sent, one of the kindest things he ever did was about a year later, my father passed away, and he sent, and that when we were on 86 on the west side at the funeral house, and the door, you know, the elevator open, and there was everyone from Benertex. He had sent everyone to come and to be with me, and he was very, very nice man, and he really worked hard to try to get my idea. You know, that was one amazing thing about Benertex is, you know, my idea of symmetry. There was a period where, you know, nobody really understood that. And yet he supported me. He trusted me that this would really be another direction. And that was, you know, this was before computers. Everything was being painted and washed. So that was a complicated thing to paint something that was to the left and then flipped and painted to the right, and really had this beautiful symmetry. Over the Benertex, I've worked with about 3 different designers. They've all, you know, heads of the studios, and they've all been wonderful. I really do like the people there very, very much. And one thing that what we've learned about my fabric and my interest in the kind of patterns, you know, I want as much color, as much pattern as possible. I love, you know, I the last exhibit at the International Quilt Museum, which is just closed yesterday, I called Paula Nadelstern, I am a patternista, because that was a name of one of my collections, because I just love to see patterns just bouncing into each other. And they were able to create that. And what we've learned over the years is, as long as the fabrics, as long as the patterns, so each of those patterns are outlined in black, a very thin little black outline. And that allows me to like put a green next to a red, you know, otherwise more painterly, the 2 colors would sort of smash up against each other and create some, you know, some browny kind of color. I always think, oh, I just want more color. Why do I care if it's brown? But it just does not print as well. It's just not as sharp. And and I, you know, like we really, so, and that means someone's got to actually, and that someone is not me, because that's not actually my skill of going and outlining, even now using everything. So if you look at my patterns, the ones that are the most vibrant, you will see that they are really carefully done in terms of that, in terms of the outline, in terms of what can fall next to each other. I mean, I've really over the years kind of learned all that, but I've learned it because they've taught it to me, and they've been really great, you know.
And I think you and I both have examples of that behind us, right? How black really makes the colors pop. Right.
Yes.
We've got an example of, well, we have your quilt there, but we have one of your beautiful fabrics that we carry here at Equilter. And then I've got behind me some quilts that are also set in a black background. And that's something that we've noticed here too, is that, you know, for us, fabrics that have color with a black background tend to sell really well. And you said something earlier that you were sort of off trend because you're so colorful. And I want to push back on that a little bit, Paula, because I would say the more colorful your patterns are, the better they sell for us. So our customers love that.
Yeah, thank you. And so I was recently had some money I had to spend at Bloomingdale's like in an hour. like,
Had
I
to
mean,
spend.
it was like these points that were just, it was my only chance to be in the city and be at the store. And I walked through like the linens and things, and it was like, it was all white, and it wasn't even real white. It was just not, I wasn't, I didn't like it. And I just felt, I would have loved to have seen some of my fabric on some of those, those pillows and that sort of thing. And, but speaking about the black, that bounces, people ask, do I design the fabric for the quilts, or do I make the, which comes first? And it's constant give and take. I mean, I'm very, so if I'm working on the 46th quilt now, I don't know, maybe the first 20, maybe the first 30 were, they had maybe a little bit of my fabric in it. I didn't have, now probably starting from about 35, the last 10 or so, I'm really primarily using my own fabric. But if something else, I'm not a purist. If I saw something, if I bought something, well, I would slip it in. It's just that I happen to like my fabric. I like, I like working with it. But again, one of the reasons that that I like the black background is because I think what's really different about my quilts, like the quilt that's behind me, which is quite an older piece, but is I camouflage the seams. Like you don't see the seams. It's just this movement. Like I want you to see the whole quilt and then come up close. I want you to see it from far away and up close. And you understand where the seams are. Sometimes you have to even put your finger on the quilt to understand where the seams are, because my patches are odd little, they're not squares, they're not shapes I want you to identify. They're just pattern, detail, motif, really, that I want to bring to the surface that will play into the next one and the next one. Well, in order to do that, very often, that's where the black background in my fabrics really work, because then if I end at the seam with a sliver of black, and if the next seam starts with a sliver of black, then you don't see that seam. You can move from seam, your eye goes across it. I mean, I can do the same thing with a red or with, but red to red or curly Q to curly Q or something like that. But black is certainly the easiest position to put there. And yes, and it doesn't matter if I've moved from, hot colors in one piece, and then the next I want to move into yellows and warmer colors, as long as your eye doesn't stop at the seam, as long as that seam is not a period. I mean, even looking at some of the amazing pieces behind you, and I'm a big fan of those, of the Egyptian tent makers. I have about 5 my own pieces that I bought, and I've bought around in France and around the world. What I'm teaching, just like how that bird stands out, the contrast that, is so beautiful. But I tend to work in a very low contrast. I admire that contrast, but my own work is very low contrast in order primarily to have that visual movement. The fluidity for me is coming from really patches to patches to patches, and your eye doesn't even know how did I get from here to there.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned that you're a fan of the tent makers of Cairo. I also have several of their pieces, and I think they have a similar aesthetic to you, because they also make, I have one over here that you can't see behind me, but they make these sort of not kaleidoscope, but medallion type, very symmetrical quilts. Is that the type of quilt that you've collected?
No, actually, I have a couple of the birds, and I do have a big, like a center medallion, not a medallion so much as almost like an arch, one.
Oh yeah.
But I had an exhibit in France at the show that's near Alsace.
Yes.
I don't speak French, and I had a wonderful, amazing time there. And they were about 2 booths away from me, so we communicated. And after spending like 3 days, like watching an exhibit, really, wasn't selling fabric. I just had an exhibit. But after this particular one, it was just so magnificent. By that, like 5 minutes before the show ended, I just had to go over and take that one home with me.
Yeah.
So I like the ones I do. Mine all do have black backgrounds. A lot of these fabulous birds.
Yeah, they're very sweet guys. I've become friends with them over the years too.
Yeah.
I heard you speak at the International Quilt Museum recently at the opening of your exhibit there. You mentioned that it's just closing today. Is that right? Today?
I think it was yesterday.
Yesterday. Okay. And it was interesting to hear you talk about your early years, that you would play around with Liberty fabrics. And I'm a big fan of Liberty Fabrics, but also William Morris. And I'm just, maybe you'd like to say a little bit about that, how that may have, when you put in all of these design ideas and then they come out with your own, it's part of that process, don't you think? Like, we absorb all of this art and color and design, and then when we go to design or make art ourselves, and then we stand back and look at it, we can see little pieces of that inspiration, which I think is a good thing.
Oh, I do. I absolutely do. I mean,
Mm.
but for me, I know that Liberty was not the little inspiration. It was the main inspiration. People ask, did I know kaleidoscopes when I started? And absolutely not. I didn't.
Mhm.
I was not a child who loved kaleidoscopes. And my first idea to make a kaleidoscope quilt was in 1986, when I just sort of stumbled on a gorgeous piece of Liberty of London fabric. I knew, I think, Liberty of London was, but there was this beautiful piece, and I just remember it was 36 inches wide. It was one of the original William Morris pieces. I'm blanking on the name of that particular pattern right now. And also, just to go back to fabric, now I admire it so much for the idea that it had 5 colors, while, I'm making things with 8 colors and finding that I don't have enough color, and how magnificent this Liberty was, this piece. It cost about $16 a yard at the time. Now it costs what, 35 to 45, but
Yeah.
it's wider. They re-engraved and it's much wider. And all I wanted was to go a quarter of a yard. I was a stay-at-home mom. I didn't have a lot of money, and I just wanted, and this was before we invented the fat quarter. So it wasn't like I even wanted a fat quarter, which is good, because if I'd gotten a fat quarter instead of my my straight across the goods, 36 inches wide piece, I wouldn't have had as many repeats. And what really, I had this idea that the fabric had, what I now know to call a center axis, a line down the middle of the pattern, that mirror image to the left and to the right. And to think that, how they did that so beautifully with, the techniques and methods they had at, what was this, the late 1800s, even before that, it's just fascinating. So I just had this idea that if I could cut that like a triangle and cut it 8 times and cut it identically, that I would make what I thought would be a kaleidoscope. And that is the start of me talking to you. So years later, many years later, I had an exhibit and I was teaching in Japan. It was my first trip to Japan. And at the big dinner, I was asked to speak, to say something. And I didn't know I was going to be asked. And a friend of mine had told me this story that I think is actually one of these urban myths kind of stories that I've heard, like, and this was about how a guy was speaking and he wanted to, to Japanese audience, and he wanted to tell a joke. And so he told his joke and the audience laughed. And afterwards he said to his audience, to his interpreter, his translator, how did you interpret my joke? I told the audience the foreigner said something funny. And they all start laughing. So now here's my chance. I'm about to speak and be translated for the first time. And should I say something funny? What should I do? So I told them about how I had, how honored I was to be there, and how I had once had this opportunity to buy this beautiful piece of Liberty of London fabric. And the moral to my story is, the takeaway from my story is, buy that piece of fabric, no matter how expensive it is, because you never know where it's going to take you. How that piece of fabric took me on this fabulous trip to and making my kaleidoscope quilts.
And magic carpet ride.
And then a few days, like 2 days later, how in a lot of the Japanese companies, like it's almost like a pyramid, like there's quilters and then at the very top there's usually a man, a guy who owns the whole business and everything. Yeah. The guy who owned that whole business came over to me, showed me, he was wearing a Liberty of London tie, and he said, it was very expensive, but I bought it. Yeah. I was away from my story when I really, anyway. So yeah, Liberty, I owe Liberty. Oh, and then from that, I sent a slide of the quilt that came out of that to Liberty in Manhattan, to their, because offices in near Rockefeller Center, and I got a commission to a series of pillows that they sold in the store, and then that was the lead off to the like the pillows were in the store during the first Great American Quilt Festival in 1986. It was very
Yeah.
exciting. What the women in the store told me was that, and then there was that, and there was a fairy tale quilt that I made like about 1984, because that's what I did before I made kaleidoscopes and all these patch. I did a lot of, little blocks that got all put together, and this was a big fairy tale quilt. And it was in the window of the Liberty of London store in Rockefeller Center. And they told me that Cher came in and asked if it was for sale, and I told her no.
Wow. When we do our second segment of this interview, I'm going to tell you about living down the street from Cher.
Okay.
Yeah.
but the story, like most stories,
Yeah.
there's a, it goes around in full circle, because
Yeah.
my niece, who is 44 and is getting married for the first time on May 7th, has always told me that that quilt was her favorite quilt, and she's getting a present. In less than a month, I'm giving it to my niece Amanda.
Oh,
So
that's
good thing Cher
awesome.
doesn't have it. Cher wouldn't even know where it was at this point,
That's cool. Well, I want to touch on the other museum, the other very prestigious venue that your work hung. And of course, I came to interview you when you had your exhibit at the American Folk Art Museum, right, in New York
Yes.
City. And we do have, I think, 2 interviews. And also we had somebody from Benartex who came for that interview. But I know that you have a story from that. Would you like to share a story? Yeah, I know you do. Tell us 1 or 2 of them.
Well, okay, and I'll give you some images if you'd like to insert them,
Sure.
I also wanted to say to anybody who plans to be in New York City from now until the end of September, the quilt I donated to the American Folk Art Museum is now on display again at the museum, is now across from Lincoln Center. And let's see if I can get the title of this exhibit right. I think it's What That Quilt Knows About Me. And it's a very, very good quilt, very unusual quilt show. It's not an art quilt show, but it's really a quilt of some of their pieces. It's all their pieces in their quilts in their collection. Everything is, but it's a fascinating, So please, if anyone's going to be in New York, make sure you go to the American Folk Art Museum. And
Great.
Very excited. Well, one of the most fun happened on the very first day when I knew that they had a 10-foot banner in front of the museum at that time. The museum was right next to MoMA on 57th Street. I just kept saying to myself, if you're not that banner, don't let that ruin your mood. I mean, this is such an honor. This is so exciting. And so there I walked to the museum. I wasn't the banner. I walked to the end of the block and came the other direction. And there I was, the other side of the banner.
Yay.
So I was so excited. I was jumping up and down. And then went in, had a great day. And someone finally said to me, don't worry, we'll fix the typo. And I'm going, typo? What typo? And on the banner, there was, instead of writing kaleidoscope, they had written kaleidoscope. And so it was this 10-foot banner that with a big giant misspelling, right outside. And this is a lesson I really want everyone to remember. It's like and I know you've used this word, Luana, I had the chutzpah, which is the nerve, which is the sass to say to them, well, what are you going to do with the old one? And they said, can I have it? So remember to always ask if in some case, don't be shy. I mean, I want. So I said, can I have it? And they said, sure, you can have it because we'll get a new one within about 10 days. And they said, and don't worry because there won't be that much poop on it, because it turns out on the banner, like sticking out, the pigeons just sit for the 3 months at the exhibits. I'm just doing their business, coming down on that banner. So it was true. When I finally got the banner, I didn't have to wash off too much poop.
Oh, yeah.
And I have it. I have it in hanging in a house I have on the North Fork of Long Island, and it's one of my most prized possessions.
Of course.
Banner.
Oh, that's really fun.
Yeah, it was great. Dream come true.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your career as a textile artist and designer before we finish this first segment?
Let's see if I can remember this quote I wrote in my very first book. I should have prepared it, but and I do everything really slowly. Everyone should know that I write slow. I quilt. I mean, I make decisions about everything very, very slowly. In fact, when my quilts were at the museum, the CBS Sunday Morning came to my apartment, and they followed me down to the garment district, and like they were here for more than a day. And a couple of years later, I was teaching a class, and everyone's surrounding me, and I'm showing some technique. And one woman said, I saw you when you were on CBS Sunday Morning. And I just say, oh, thank you so much. I'm like, I was just, that's so nice that you saw that. Thank you so much. And she said, you sew so slowly. That was her takeaway. I was on a TV show, and this. So yes, when I'm sewing, I go put, 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 put. I really, I do. I sew slowly. I do everything slowly
on the machine. You're
on my
talking
sewing
about,
machine, but also like like when I make, I'm looking at 10 fabrics before I make a choice, for one fabric. I don't like it, I'm not going to choose it. If I don't like it, I'm not gonna like it later. So
well, for something so complicated, you have to be deliberate, I would think. I mean, that doesn't surprise me.
yeah, and that was partly, that's a decision I didn't realize. I mean, I didn't realize the importance of, but I do not sell my quilts. Remember, I'm going back again now to I think that's partly because I didn't come out of an art school background. So equating the selling of your art with the art, and you being an artist, that wasn't ingrained in me that much. I didn't. I really have made my career by teaching and just doing fabric, and when I travel, selling the fabric, but a lot of teaching, and then and by making a decision not to sell the quilts in the collection and having them for exhibit when there were exhibition possibilities occurred, I could take as long as I needed to make a quilt. Of course, there have been deadlines along the way, and of course, I'm at the last minute with a deadline, and I'm rushed and anxious. Of course, but some of the quilts have been 2-year quilts. Some of the quilts have been 6 quilts. Certainly, when I was younger, I made quilts faster. I did everything faster, and now it's like so. So that is something. Now I have made kind of the decision at this stage, and I think and part of it is the pandemic. I mean, I had classes lined up. I mean, I have a 5-year calendar, because I needed to know where was I going to be 2 years and 3 years, and then the pandemic's just stopped me. And I'm not a very great on the computer. I don't really feel that my classes translate into computer classes. I do feel I can do a very good Zoom lecture because I have professional photography and lots of stories, and so I can lecture, but not really teach. And so as 3 years later, and white hair, and just getting, realizing my age, and I mean, when you mentioned that pushing those 50-pound suitcases, it's like, yeah, I don't know what would have stopped me if not for, and so now I'm reaching the point where I do want to exhibit as much as possible with your help. I'm actually having an exhibit next June to September at the New England Quilt Museum, which I'm quite excited about. It'll be a fairly large exhibit with some pieces that haven't been shown for a long time, and then I'm looking to sell the work, and so I've sort of come to that. I've come to that, like it's time, and something that many of the many quilters of my age, and who've been on the circuit for so long, are thinking about the legacy and what will happen with the quilts. So,
right. It's like letting your children go.
It is.
Yeah. Well, I think that we will bring this first segment to a close. And that was great to hear all those stories, Paula. And if those of you watching would like to look for this, we'll have another segment, which is a little more personal and a little more chatty and maybe a little gossipy, huh? we have some fun things that we're going to talk about. So thank you for watching this first segment, part 1 of Paula Nadelstern. We love Paula. And hopefully you guys will check out the second one.
I have one last thing to tell you.
Oh, okay.
So I would like to tell you, and if anyone else is listening, they can know also that next year's collection, fabric collection, for Better Text Fabric Collection, is finished. I think it's going to be wonderful. And the title is What If? because, we're constantly asking that creative question, like, well, what if I make this yellow? What if I turn this upside down? What if I, add this or do this or do, how many times a day do you, when you're designing and working, do you say, well, what if, what if? So
Mm.
next collection is going to be called What If.
Cool. Thanks for letting us in on that little secret.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you, Paula. And
you.
we'll please hang around and check out part 2.